joining me to discuss how the machinations with the Build Back Better plan impact the racial wealth gap and why that gap persists is founding director of the Institute of Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School, Dr. Darrick Hamilton. Darrick, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it is my pleasure to be in conversation with you.
First, okay, so I want to just react to what we're seeing play out right now. Many people didn't think that the Progressive Caucus actually had the juice to see this through and to really drive the human infrastructure package. People thought that they were going to kind of, give up at some point, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. And I would suggest that it's fair to say that because I know you're a former Bernie surrogate, these are probably your people. So I would love for you to give us your take and the scoop on how the Progressive Caucus is playing their strategy right now.
Well, what I like is it appears that this is a movement. This is a growing movement. And, I like the fact that they're sticking to their values. At the end of the day, we certainly want this presidency to be successful. We certainly want a bill to come out. But, in the opening statements that you began with, the word compromise, that's a tough word to hear, but the word building out infrastructure is a great word to hear. So there's good and bad.
Why, though, are we always compromising with crazy people? I mean, this is the thing. I am all for coming up with collaborative solutions, right? But I feel like the Democrats are always in this position where we're going to give something up. We got to let go of something. We got to compromise. We're never really going to get what the people deserve because we're cowering to a faction that frankly doesn't care about us. And I just, wonder what you're hearing from progressives about how they're trying to navigate that and what they're going to do, frankly, to move the needle forward on this. Stalling will only last for so long, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact strategy, but there is some good in there. The fact that we're having this conversation is good. Again, I don't like the word compromise, and neither do you, because one thing we know is that when we think about race, the group that's typically the first to be compromised are the issues related to those that are most marginalized, which in the United States context has been Black people.
Exactly. Let's talk about those issues. So President Biden came out today with the significantly pared down version of the human infrastructure bill. And are you concerned that these cuts are going to significantly undermine our ability to combat the racial wealth gap and inequity in America generally?
Certainly. I mean, we started from a position, you said 3.5 million. 3.5 million is not what we need, but a word like down payment is a useful word. Now we're even further down from 3.5. And I want to be careful because I want the narrative to be clear that a lot that's in the bill that's going to be successful is indeed a shift. I mean, we could talk about the child tax credit, and then both of our mutual good friend Dorian Warren has pointed out that this is the 25th year anniversary of welfare reform. So if you juxtapose the child tax credit with welfare reform, there's no question that that's indicative of a new narrative and a new perspective by which we're using government and the tax code, our most powerful fiscal tool, to empower people, to send resources directly to people in an equitable way to empower them, as opposed to that narrative of we need to incentivize people to go to work because they choose not to. What we've seen is that when people are fueled with some resources, not only do they work more, but they can work more with better conditions. They're empowered to bargain better. So, I see this as mixed. The reality is that we have an entire party that's obstructing the progress of America. And then we have some moderates that are also obstructing this bill. But if we think about it in the scheme of things, we should certainly not lose sight of the progress and the visionary aspects of really a shift in American public policy.
I am so heartened by the way that you just described that and broke down the narrative shift for sure, because we're talking about welfare queens and welfare to work back in the 90s. And now here we are talking about investing in human infrastructure. And that messaging piece is absolutely a 180 and everything. And I got to tell you, Darrick, the last couple of nights on this show, we've actually been citing new polling data that suggests that Americans have no idea what's in this bill, even though they support all the policy provisions. They don't understand the bill itself and aren't buying into the jargony messaging and brand of Build Back Better. And so I'm curious, as someone who just eloquently dropped that mic for us on the narrative and what we're messaging now, why do you think that the average person isn't picking up what you just put down?
Well, we've had 50, 40 years of an infrastructure where policy hasn't worked for the average person. So we need to realize some of those changes and start experiencing it. Once people start getting that $300 a month as not compensation, but as a reality of having a child and realizing what it is to have a child in America, it becomes harder to turn back. So we need government to start doing good. And then when people realize that government can do good, it creates a momentum, a movement forward that makes it harder for us to turn back.
Mm-hmm. I've been talking a lot about this concept of a racial wealth gap that we experience in this country where, white families have way more money fundamentally starting off than black families do. And so many folks in our audience may actually feel the effects of the racial wealth gap, but might not know how we even got into this situation. So, Professor, I'm hoping that you can just break down a few of the key factors of what, in fact, the racial wealth gap is and the factors that resulted in that disparity.
I mean, if somebody came from outer space today and looked at the wealth disparity between blacks and whites, inevitably they might presume that there's something wrong with black people. Well, that understanding would be devoid of history. It would be devoid of understanding that from 1619, when the first black person landed on the shores in America in bondage, that as a capital resource for a white land-owning plantation class, that's exemplary of why we have this racial wealth gap today. And of course, it didn't end with slavery. We could talk about the Homestead Act. We could talk about other public policy, including the ways in which the FHA was constructed with redlining and restrictive covenants. I mean, we have a long public policy history in which one group of Americans, namely white people, have been empowered by literally government giveaways. And government giveaways aren't a bad thing. It's not a bad thing for government to provide some capital for a group of people or for its citizens to have access to an asset that will appreciate over their lifetime. What is immoral and what is bad about that history was the fact that it was done in a way that was racially disparate, that by both design and implementation, black people were excluded. And then there's one more aspect of that history that we should mention if we want to talk about the racial wealth gap, and that is when black people were able to amass resources. And I should remind the audience that this is the 100th anniversary year of the Tulsa massacre, that those resources were never codified by the political protections that were afforded to white people. Basically, black capital and black personhood has always been vulnerable to theft, terror, and just simply all other forms of exploitation and malfeasance. That has to change.
Mm-hmm. You are dropping so much knowledge about the structural issues that we face in this country that are baked into how we do business, the assumptions that we make about people, how the federal government operates. And we are talking a lot about surface level solutions, right? So tuition-free college would be great, but that doesn't really address the fact that black people with college degrees are actually making less than white people with high school diplomas. So what should Congress actually do? And what kind of legislation should they craft to combat the structural inequities that you're talking about?
The positive thing is we're moving in the direction of what I'm going to describe as what I think is going to be structural solutions. Basically, when we think about human rights, the element of human rights that we often ignore is economic rights, ensuring that everyone has access to adequate resources so that they can have true agency in their lives. So there is no one silver bullet. So tuition-free college is necessary. Medicare for all is necessary. Guaranteed income, child tax credit, those are necessary. Baby bonds are necessary. Reparations is necessary if America is ever going to take full accountability of this history and change the narratives and the ways in which we think about poverty in general. So, at the risk of going on and on and on, I think the bottom line is we need a government that ensures that its people has the enabling goods and services, not a right to go to a disco per se, but, and there's nothing wrong with entertainment, but the necessary goods and services that when they engage in transactions, they're not completely vulnerable to exploitation, extrapolation, or simply charity. So, make it simple. In order to build wealth, how do you build wealth? It is wealth that begets wealth. If you want to own a home, if you want to build up your wealth through home ownership, you need a down payment. Otherwise, you're a renter or homeless. So ensuring that people have some capital to get into home ownership. If you want to start a business, however good your idea may be, if you don't have capital, you won't have access to start that business. You will simply, you will be a worker and someone else will benefit from your ingenuity. If you want to have a debt-free college education and benefit from something like a 401k program because your job affords that, well, then one needs some capital when they start.
Darrick, we have got to take a quick break, but I want you to sit tight with me because we are talking so much right now about the politics and the policies around all of this with the racial wealth gap, but I don't want to let corporations off the hook in the private sector either. So we will be right back. My conversation with Darrick Hamilton is going to continue next on Amplified. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We are talking about the racial wealth gap and the long-standing problems that have contributed to it. And now I want to turn the conversation to what can actually be done to solve these issues and bridge the gap. Dr. Darrick Hamilton is still with us. And Darrick, I really want to talk about some solutions here. You are the founder of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. So can you tell us about what your work there entails? What you're studying?
You know what I really like? The word power in our name. So our work is really about enabling people to be able to achieve their self-determined goals. And what's the most critical ingredient to do that? Power. So we are really trying to change the political economy. We're using research, actionable research that we can actually come up with mechanisms to break down restrictive hierarchy, and then public engagement because we realize that it's going to take a social movement to achieve this. But we really have the lofty goal of promoting a moral economy so everybody can have economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity.
Oh, I love that so much. We've been talking about what can be done legislatively, but what are some ways that the private sector can help to combat the racial wealth gap?
So the private sector, for one, should be good actors. So treat their workers fair and produce products that are fair and not exploitive and extractive. And then two, I would suggest that they take chances, experiment, fund something like a demonstration of baby bonds, fund something like ensuring that people have access to housing in a locality. So in other words, I would encourage the private sector to motivate government by doing demonstrations, and some are already doing this. But the first thing they could do is simply be good citizens. At the end of the day, we want a society that's not at the whim of corporations, but corporations can be good actors and behave accordingly in good ways and not be extractive and exploitive. But we got to have a public sector that doesn't rely on their charitable whims, but ensures that people have the necessary ingredients so that they can be successful.
Because philanthropy and charity has not solved poverty and gotten us out of this mess. And what we see happening now is that the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and certainly the racial wealth gap, continue to expand. So I always find that this conversation gets really tricky, because when we start to think about ways to have public-private partnerships or to have good corporate citizens, we're trying to solve the perils, frankly, of capitalistic behavior and activity through capitalism. So how do you reconcile that?
And I'm going to say this: capitalism, socialism, those are polars that are really useful in the classroom, but in practice, there's rarely a society, none that I know of, that realizes them into fruition. When we had the bailout of banks during the last Great Recession, that certainly wasn't capitalism. So again, I'm of the notion that regardless of ideology, human rights require economic rights, require that people are not poor, require that people are not homeless, require that people are not sick, require that people have some capital. And that's been my framework. But the role of corporations, if they're going to be good, take chances, be bold, go into the belly of the beast, go into an area where government has been negligent in their activities, and there are plenty of communities in the South, and then demonstrate with something like guaranteed income what can actually happen when government facilitates people to be their best selves. So in other words, I don't think we need to be relying on corporations. I think corporations should be good citizens and should be regulated. And by the way, corporations exist at the privilege of our public. They're political constructions. A public charter is a political document. So we get to choose what a corporation is, how it operates. But at the end of the day, it is government's fiduciary responsibility to ensure that its people thrive.
Are there any companies that you can think of that are doing some of the things that you're talking about and doing them well?
I'd be remiss to say that we don't receive funding from some corporations at the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. I'm hesitant to name specific corporations, but I'll definitely call out bad actors when I see them behaving irresponsible. It's part of our job, if we have a megaphone, to point that out. But in general, I suggest that if corporations are going to engage in trying to make changes, they use their innovations not to be in the business of addressing inequity and poverty directly, beyond just being good employers and good producers, but rather they demonstrate to government and fuel social movements and build momentum so that we all can have a just and moral society.
Let's talk about workers. We are seeing a record number of unions and workers striking right now. Do you think that we're seeing a nationwide shift in how workers think about the value of their labor?
Yeah, I mean, we've had 40 years where all of America's productivity gains have pretty much gone to the elite and upper middle class. And the system now is, it's vulnerable. The sad reality is that we also saw on January 6th, nearly a fascist coup of our government. So the vulnerability can go multiple ways. We hope it doesn't go towards the way of fascism, but there's also, we witnessed during a pandemic year all across America, people shouting in unison that Black Lives Matter. And as you just pointed out, collective bargaining is growing. People are now coming together collectively to demand better conditions at work. And that is the direction I hope our nation goes. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also realistic in knowing that we can't get satisfied. We can't compromise. We're going to need to still be steadfast and work hard to ensure we have justice. And the last thing I'll say about this is commit to justice because it's the right thing to do, period. We don't need evidence. We don't need, do it because it's the right thing to do. So I'm glad that workers are now stepping up and committing momentum towards justice.
So let us have some hope and see the future out in front of us and remind people what are some of the long-term benefits that really could come from this season of labor action, frankly. I mean, I think this could be foundational, no?
I do. I mean, we're already seeing the change. We're already seeing, we start with rhetoric and we start with policy. It is still inadequate. I mean, and the challenges we face are daunting. We haven't even talked about our vulnerability to climate change. But despite these daunting challenges, we also have hope and we also have a pathway forward towards justice. What we know is that despair will only lead to the status quo. At the end of the day, it is our government. At the end of the day, it is our economy. And at the end of the day, we have a monetary system that can afford us the resources to achieve the economy by way of government of a society that we all would like, deserve, and that would be towards that trajectory of justice.
I'm glad you talk in those big terms about our society. I'm thinking about our friend Heather McGhee, who talks and writes about how all of this racism, the racial wealth gap, hurts white people too. And this isn't just about black people being mad because we're a little broker than everybody else. This is actually something that is devastating our society. So I'm going to give you the last word here, just to tell people like how the racial wealth gap ultimately hurts all of us.
Yeah, I mean, the narratives about poverty and inequality, white populations that are poor are basically racialized. When we talk about deadbeat dads and welfare queens, there's the person running for senator. I don't even want to mention his name because I certainly hope his opponent defeats him, Morgan Harper. The person running for senator is using white people in similar derogatory terms that we refer to black people who have been poor. So addressing inequality by using resources will improve all our lives. But at the end of the day, I do want to point out that white privilege is indeed real. So, it is the case that there is transactional value associated with race, and that's an immoral society. Now, that's transactional value when we ground value in self-interested accumulation, greed with no bounds. Now, if we define value in humanistic terms, in terms like dignity, in terms like shared prosperity, then white privilege has no place. And that is a society that's not immoral, but one grounded in justice, one grounded in humanity.
Darrick Hamilton, founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. Thank you so much for dropping all this knowledge on us tonight, and I hope to have you back on Amplified. Appreciate you.